I would like to briefly introduce the context of that event discussion today, and then we'll move on to the short presentations. This is the first event of the research cluster on city cultures, which started a year ago. And we would like to use that as a kind of almost as a kind of platform to open up certain issues and also to see where people kind of stand in relation to this issue. So in one way to kind of construct a network of issues and people today and identify kind of themes which people share, and then use that in order to organize 3 events next year. One of the events will be a workshop, another will be a publication. So also, as you see, we try to experiment with different kind of formats. And these here also we try to see how a discussion group can work in public and not just to have people presenting their papers. I would like just now to explain how what was the starting point of the cluster of that research project. There are many, of course, new cities emerging, kind of designed all over the world. And although there are many kind of writings on new patterns of development, sustainability issues, economic policies, it seemed to me that there was not debate or enough debate on the very kind of primary issue of what a city is. And in one way, that's how I start kind of formulating the framework of that project. So, okay, how we can start thinking of framing again, of finding the terms to think and talk about the city as a composite space, as a composite environment, as kind of the site par excellence of conflicts, of different kind of a diversity of norms of use, social norms, and of multiple identities. And in the end, the city, if I could use the term, although I use it with certain reluctance, the city as a political space. And that's in one way, the term political and the city as a political space, I hope to become one of the kind of issues of debate. And that was also an attempt to not only to start reflecting on the city, but also start reflecting on the terms, as I said before, the terms we use in order to frame our engagement with the city, and also to frame kind of our thinking, and also to address this kind of what I call the new urban formations or new forms of urbanity. So in one way, if I could outline the objectives of that event today, is more to construct in one way or in many ways the object of study. So if I say what is a city, it sounds very kind of generic, very general. So in one way, it is about mapping out the questions, mapping out the issues, and construct what might be the object of study. And I think unavoidably that object of study has to be located at the intersection of multiple disciplinary forms of knowledge and multiple techniques of research. And that brings me to the second objective of that event and of the cluster, which is to think and develop new forms of research, kind of new forms of engaging conceptually, but also architecturally, with what we may still call the city. And of course, another objective is a more particular objective, is to reflect on the architecture's potential of engagement with the city, because of course we can reflect on the city from multiple perspectives, from multiple kind of disciplinary forms or fields, but I think for us is of particular interest to see how architecture can still, the architectural project can still engage, can still address this kind of multiple conditions or these novel conditions. To what extent can the architectural project can formulate a discourse on the city, or can again become a critical instrument to analyze and address these kind of novel conditions. And of course, if we take it from the other side, to also understand what is the function of the city, of the urban, within the current architectural thinking and design research. Because I think it goes both ways. It's not only how architects engage with the city, but what is the function that the city has always played in the formation of an architectural knowledge and within the design research. And the last objective, which somehow relates to what I said before, it's to kind of redefine the terms with which we try to frame all these issues and talk about and think. So in one way, redefine the words, or try to see if it's possible to develop not only new forms of research or new ways of thinking, or if it's still necessary to find other terms in order to describe these, what I call the new formations, either urban formations or identity formations. I will stop here because the aim of today's afternoon is to kind of open up the discussion, and I'll ask the people at the table to present briefly their approach, their position on the city. And I have to say this is a part of a call of 4 positions, contemporary positions on the city. And all of the people who are now with us have contributed to the call with a position. So in one way, I asked them today to state briefly their kind of standpoint, their perspective, and then in order to kind of put forward the issues in order to have the discussion. And because I said the aim is to open up the discussion, please feel free to participate and kind of engage with the issues which will be put kind of forward. Just I will introduce briefly our contributors today. David Cunningham, who is at the University of Westminster, and he's the Deputy Director of the Institute for Contemporary Cultural Theory.
Modern and Contemporary Culture.
And he's currently writing a book on the theories of the Metropolis. Douglas Spencer, who is involved in landscape urbanism, and he's currently working on, if you can, on the architecture's engagement with immaterial labor and controlled society. Peter Carl, who is currently directing the PhD program at the London Metropolitan University, and he has been teaching for 30 years history and philosophy of architecture at the University of Cambridge. Chris Lee and Sam Jacoby, who are directors of the new MPhil program, Projective Cities, which will start in September here at the AA. And they have worked extensively on issues of typology and the city. And they all, and Ross Adams, sorry because you're sitting there, Ross Adams, who is currently working on the rise of urbanism and liberalism at the London Consortium. So all of them, they have, as I said, contributed with their position. There are 5 very different positions, and I think that's also the point of having all of them here today. And I'll just, I would like to start with Peter and his concept of polis, move on to David and his theory of Metropolis. I think this will be quite the one in opposition to the other. Douglas and Chris and Lee, who will more focus on different forms of architectural engagement with a city, and Ross, who will kind of, he's focusing on a kind of a critique of sustainability.
Right, okay. Good afternoon, folks. Thank you. I'm not going to talk about the polis. What I'm going to do is a kind of quick symptomatology leading up to the idea that the several sort of ways that we tend to generalize city, form, space, network, so on and so forth, have grown out of a particular post-Enlightenment circumstance and make, in fact, city very difficult to recover. Right. Very briefly, I'm sure you all know these 2 images. The tragic set and comic set is rendered from Vitruvius, is rendered by Serlio, in which the tragic set on the top, in case you haven't seen them before, is endowed with all the attributes of beauty, meaning, concentration of the primary institutions, so on and so forth. And the tragic set is seen to be the milieu of merchants and artisans, and is seen to be ugly and uncoordinated. Now, whether or not Colin Rowe was right about the Renaissance when he said it was about, Renaissance town planning was about inserting a tragic set into a prevailing comic, i.e. medieval, he was certainly right about architectural history subsequently. And in 500 years, it's purified to this form, where the Marais is the tragic set, and the Voisin Plan is, sorry, the Marais is a comic set, and the Plan Voisin is the tragic set. And this kind of tension is what I want to look at for the next few minutes. It took another 80 years for it to reach this form, Dubai and London at the same scale, with the ratio of city to water reversed. And it's come down, the tension can probably be best summarized in these 2 images. It's a tension I would describe, for the sake of the afternoon, as one between economics and ethos. The traditional city, here represented by Klenz's painting of Udine from the early 19th century, is endowed with a kind of nostalgia, as if it can never be recovered, and it can only exist in lovely paintings like this, or very artificially constructed environments. Yet as the standard of meaning, it still exerts this kind of silent claim. By contrast, and what you're looking at on the left is a plot of, it was an epidemiology simulation run at Los Alamos, where they presumed that a terrorist put botulism in an ice cream cone and then plotted how long it would take to spread to the rest of Portland, Oregon. These descriptions of city based on the kind of thing that you know from Adam Smith, that is to say, an economy is built out of the action of an individual agent, and the nature of the collective order that's described is, statistical trends, highly abstract kinds of relations. And therefore and it's not a new realization. Corb's famous tension between the Parthenon and the motor car, which I've updated to the right as Hagia Sophia church, mosque, now museum, and traffic, is similarly working with this tension between some sense of a kind of embodied culture in which one's work has meaning, one's city has a kind of identity, and some form of modernity that is described best statistically as networks, as trends or tendencies. And the standard formulation of the social sciences of the individual is as agent or subject, and the next level of involvement is generally fairly mysterious or a network of concepts. And it was reprised in Oshi's Ghost in the Shell, where actually a very careful reciprocity back and forth between what he built up as a kind of traditional Oriental city, sort of like Hong Kong, and what to him, he didn't have the computer power at the time. All of that stuff is built in by hand. A game between what he saw as a kind of info world and a very concrete world, and in this case, a garbage truck as a kind of piece of virusware going through, a world of signs, and its co-representation in some sort of central server. I don't think the word server was around when he did that. And as this economic description means that is part and parcel of the kinds of theories of meaning that you know from people like Barth, where the fragments compete with each other on a kind of equal basis. And just to celebrate what's going on next door, I thought it included a piece of content which is full of these kind of fragments, and I'm not sure he does, what to make of them, whether there's a conclusion to be drawn. Are they interesting? Are they relevant? Are they just epiphenomena? This is the world we're living in. And one ends up with a kind of city as it's understood at night, as a world of signs that gives you directions, offers you pleasures, has no gravity, and seems to be, in fact, a city of systems. And of course, you then get whole cities retailed like Songdo. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's seen as a gateway to Northeast Asia. This use of the primitive motif of a gateway is obviously an attempt to say to Hong Kong, there's another door to Asia. And then it's retailed as a kind of combination of what they saw as the best cities in the world: Sydney, New York City, Venice, and they didn't have enough room on the website for Paris, which appears elsewhere in their literature. And you end up being able to think city as, as I say, as a kind of product. Right. As a kind of quick setting of boundaries, these are all at the same scale. At the bottom is obviously central Paris, a medieval framework, mostly 17th and 18th century, with, and later interventions. At the top is the fastest growing city or town in America, a place called Olathe, Kansas, which obviously obeys with its, suburban plots and its mall, all laid out on a distribution network that neatly obeys, it's like a living graph of an economic description of the town. And then in the middle, Los Angeles, which started out in a similar way, but has subsequently begun to nucleate, where it's got places that are much more dense than New York City, very culturally specific, and indicates how these megacities might begin to transform. And I'm not going to talk about it, but just as a standard of measure, that's obviously Dharavi on the right. What's generally been missing is an understanding of the comic set, i.e. we've got a whole series of ways of rendering the city as concept, as space, as form, as network, blah, and making and perfecting it according to those concepts. But what's always laid in the background is the problem of the comic set, the city in which the praxis comes to some sort of political visibility. It's not that it went away totally. Here, for example, is the famous attempt by Candilis and Woods to replace the medieval topography in front of Frankfurt Cathedral that had been flattened by bombs with, of course, a megastructure. And of course, in the period of topology, there was a lot of interesting research done. This was Imanino's students looking at Paris on the left before the Forum Leal was installed. But the results, because their notion of topology tended to be about objects, i.e. units, and that sort of thing, dwelling units, rather than typicalities, their own interventions, in the case of, for example, Iba, and this block is, if you don't know, down here, tend to be a kind of large-scale building, i.e. it's a kind of, confuses architectural and urban order. Because the notion that their notion of typology was so organized around architectural objects, and the combination, transformation, manipulation of those, and not oriented to the typicalities that grow out of practical situations, it never really attained the kind of density or richness that, for example, you see in this, which is from the 14th in Paris. That map simply shows you where you can drive, but it helps you understand what's going on. All of that, the block is protected by this outside, and this is a world of kind of cities within a city. And one of the tasks, it seems to me, for kind of parametric urbanism is to be able to develop typicalities as deep and rich as this. When looking at London, you see fragments of this kind of order. It's disposed in different ways, most notably the Guy's Hospital block in Southwark, which has really several layers of depth. And interestingly, by contrast, the city, which looks from the air like it'll be full of rich difference, is actually 99% office, with the things that are in other colors like cafes and restaurants. In fact, the comic set has a rich life in things like computer games and certain B-movies, where it's endowed with a kind of danger and, against the system sort of stuff. This is, of course, from Half-Life 2, where the good guys live in a kind of Romania and the bad guys live in Rem. Now, as a consequence of this kind of tension between a sort of conceptual schematism and a concrete life, that is to say, between the city of economics and the city of ethos, there's a kind of I think we can hypothesize a general split in the representation, where the collective order is represented in various forms of description, such as you see at the top, and the individual becomes characterized by psychology, which of course is a discipline that only grew up in the post-Metropolis period. And in between are those aspects of the bottom that can be quantified in branding and so on and so forth. This means that the nature of the collective life remains obscure, and the city itself becomes experienced as kind of episodes, fragments, possibilities, the more or less interesting, more or less savage or witty, very rarely profound. And in fact, most of the current descriptions eschew profundity, in insisting that, in fact, you could raise it all to the level of information. And I would say then that the business of treating the city as any form of formal topography is kind of missing the point, or is getting the point only partially, and allows one to become subsumed in systematic or conceptual orders that will always see the living city as deformation of that order, as deformation of the ideal, as deformation of, any rate. And that therefore, the way to look at city is as a topography of praxis. That is to say, it is rooted in conflict, it is rooted in difficulty, it is rooted in disease, sickness, people who don't get it, people who don't think their life can simply be purchased, so on and so forth. And we don't, I didn't want to get too prescriptive. So all I really want to put on the table is the idea that if there is a political issue, it's rooted in the typicalities of situations and the settings they command. A city, like architecture, like being, is something you can't completely objectify. It's a matter of working with it. Thanks.
I don't have any images with me, so you'll just have to rely on my words. Clearly talking about what is the city in 10 minutes is a fairly insane proposition, so I'm going to do this as polemically as possible, and I think probably disagree at least up to a point with Peter's argument just now. In a sense, the first polemical point in relation to what is the city is that the question we really need to ask, I'm going to claim, is what is the metropolis? And to, in some sense, insist upon a distinction between the city and the metropolis that's made around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, but which tends to be elided or occluded in most discourses today. And following from that, the claim that we are not done with the metropolis, as it were, or we're not done with the metropolis any more than we are done with modernity or capitalism, to which both the metropolis is linked, despite the recent proliferation of discourses around the post-metropolis and so on. Someone like Ed Soja, for example. Something kind of straightforwardly implausible about Soja's argument, given that the city-state is supposed to last for 2,000 years and the metropolis manages barely 150 before it's displaced by something else. This seems to me kind of intuitively unlikely. So we're not done with the metropolis. And the next polemical point is to say, in relation to this then, the call is back to Simmel. That we need to go back to Simmel's account of the metropolis right at the beginning of the 20th century. And in particular, we need to re-understand Simmel's account at the beginning of the 20th century, which has tended to be reduced to a series of particular metropolitan phenomena, but in which we've often lost sight of the logic which underlies those phenomena in Simmel's own argument. And that logic is essentially money. Logic is essentially money. In a sense, we need to reread Simmel's essay, The Metropolis of Mental Life, as he conceived it himself, as a footnote to his huge book on the philosophy of money, rather than as simply a kind of typology of particular urban instances like the blasé type, nervous stimulation and so on. At least we need to see all of those things in Simmel as connected together by the money economy. So for Simmel in that essay, the metropolis is fundamentally, he says, dominated by and is the seat of the money economy. Now, it seems to me if we're seriously going to think about the urban today, we need to start from the acceptance that remains the case for contemporary urban form. That expanded as this metropolitan logic is, essentially today the dominant form of the urban, and in fact in many ways the increasingly dominant form of the urban, remains the metropolis in this fundamental sense as Simmel describes it. That is, as an urban form which is dominated by and which is the seat of the money economy. Now the key point for Simmel in relation to this then, around this logic of money, is that this logic of money is fundamentally a logic of abstraction. And this is where I think I'm probably going to begin to disagree with Peter. It's a logic of abstraction not in the sense that it's often been understood in urban theory, as in relation to, say, someone like de Certeau, or in a slightly more complex way in someone like Lefebvre, in which abstraction is fundamentally opposed to the concrete. So the beginning of de Certeau's famous essay on walking the city, many of you will know, he's standing on top of the old World Trade Center in New York, and he's looking down on the city, and he says, and he describes it variously as the concept city or the planner's city. And he says, when we look down, we see the city as this clean, neat, abstract form. And as against that, de Certeau poses the realm of the concrete, the everyday, the practical. Now, my argument is that what Simmel grasps in 1903 is that this opposition no longer holds, that essentially our everyday life is an everyday life of abstraction. You know, every time we go shopping, every time we take money out of a cash machine, let alone when we're on an iPhone, we're existing in our everyday lives in utterly abstract spaces. So abstraction is no longer simply the realm of the plan or the concept or the system. Abstraction is the very stuff of everyday life, and particularly of everyday urban life. And that goes at both the level of space itself, in which metropolitan logic for Simmel is a logic by which space itself becomes increasingly exchangeable. You know, it is fundamentally different from what Lefebvre calls absolute or historical space. So in absolute or historical space, a church is where a church is, and it can't be anywhere else, and it can't be anything other than a church. In the space of the Metropolis, a church can become an apartment block, it can become a cafe, it can become a recording studio, it can become a pub, it can become whatever else. You know, the logic of the Metropolis is ultimately that all spaces globally are exchangeable. And this logic is fundamentally the logic of money. And it is fundamentally the logic that we live precisely on a concrete everyday basis. Whereas it is precisely what Marx calls, paradoxically, a concrete abstraction, or a real abstraction. It is an abstraction that is utterly real to our lives. Now, polemically then to end, and to go to Marina's question about the city as a political space, it seems to me then that we need to rethink in this regard what we might mean by an urban politics. And in particular, we need to think an urban politics not in relation to the polis, not in relation to those kind of concrete forms of political exchange and discussion, which give us the name politics itself, but we need something like a metropolitics. In other words, we need to think that if the everyday itself is utterly inhabited by abstraction, and if this is unlikely, I think, to change for all sorts of reasons, then we need a politics that in some sense takes place on that same level of abstraction. You know, that what has become the very difficult political challenge, certainly when we begin to think of the urban as a global process, is to think about how we operate politically within these abstract forms. The problem at the moment, of course, the problem as it's been for at least 150 years, is that the only form that has that social extent is the form of money itself, or the form of capital. In other words, it's only capital or money that has that kind of, today, global universalism. The problem for political movements clearly is the difficulty of achieving a similar kind of universalism politically, or collectively, what it means to form something like a collective politics or a collective life. And I think this is the difficulty for urban politics today. And none of this, of course, is to negate the claims of something like grassroots politics, which remain very important. But it is to suggest that grassroots politics are always inherently going to remain limited within a metropolitan situation until we are in some sense able to think of a politics which might operate within these abstract spaces themselves. Certainly, I think what we need to be very suspicious of increasingly is an account of urban theory or of urban politics which presumes that what we need to do is somehow get behind abstractions to something that is more real, more concrete, a kind of everyday which is somehow behind the distortions of abstraction. I'm not sure that there is a concrete in that sense behind the distortions of abstraction, or that abstraction is any longer a distortion in that sense. It seems to me that abstraction itself is the production of certain kinds of space and of certain kinds of social and spatial experience. And any adequate politics today is going to have to take place on the terrain of that production of abstraction, not seeking, in a kind of mythical or romantic sense, some concreteness behind it. Okay, that's my polemical argument. Thank you.
Okay. Well, distinct from the previous two presentations, focusing much more on architecture and its current engagement with urban form. So I'm going to read from the paper. Sorry if it's a bit dense. I'll be happy to go back and clarify anything that needs clarifying. Okay, so I'm starting with Manfredo Tafuri's point made some time ago that architecture's autonomy is undermined by the phenomenal growth of the industrial city and the rise of planning in the 19th and 20th centuries. But the current ambitions of the discipline of architecture to reproduce the urban within its own envelope may be considered then an attempt to recover its powers over the metropolis. Architecture now assumes for itself and within the volumetric capacity of its now large-scale projects the responsibility for reproducing those forms of collectivity, communication and social cohesion associated with a certain ideal of the city. So for Koolhaas, as many of you will be familiar with, the scale of contemporary architecture achieves for it a position in which its powers, the powers of architecture as a form of social organisation, now rival or at least coexist with those of the city rather than being subsumed within the urban fabric. Alejandro Zero Polo, in his recent discourse on the politics of the envelope, writes about how the skyscraper has a vertical envelope where it once served as a kind of aloof status symbol for big business only and contained its operations there, is now posited as a means of, as he calls it, urban democratization through the inclusive potential of its programmatic versatility. Critically, the model of urban reality, which architecture now transposes to its interior, is not that of the modernist city precisely, with that model's aspirations towards a kind of rationalised movement and linear flow, but one which operates as a space of complex social exchanges and spontaneous encounters. It's that model that's being valorised, I would argue. And it's through this appeal to the bottom-up and self-organising and subjectively experienced character of the city that its interiorisation within architecture is framed as an essentially progressive development. Certain formal strategies are understood to be instrumental to the production of these conditions and key to their supposedly progressive potential. Hence, for the architects who have self-consciously adopted and adapted for their own ends a range of conceptual terms from contemporary theoretical resources, so those of complexity and emergence and the theories, of course, of Deleuze and Guattari, and latterly of figures such as Manuel de Landa and Peter Sloterdijk. Porosity, complexity, folding, continuous variation, and perhaps most of all smoothness are held to be spatial tropes simultaneously corresponding to and productive of a process of social emancipation, where modernity, the argument goes, and the disciplinary society with which it corresponded until the latter part of the 20th century was striated by spaces of enclosure. Spatial smoothing, it is argued, now releases the fluid becomings that will break down the old hierarchies. Gradient vectors, artificial topographies, and articulated grounds complexify, blur, or entirely eradicate the boundaries that once contained the subject within categorically and physically discrete realms of spatial experience. Now, dispensing with that function of enclosure, architecture draws within itself, on the model of its exterior context, the complexity of the urban condition, whilst claiming its associated freedoms, openness, and forms of collectivity as its own, as its own agenda. So, for example, what Hadid terms the interior urban condition, she writes, leaves room for active interpretation on the part of its inhabitants. And, she continues, it enables architecture to occupy space and make clusters of organisation in such a way that people from all levels of society meet each other. Now, Deleuze himself came to see, though, that the smoothing of social space was a production of a new terrain, historically, by and for capital. Within the fluid composition of this new terrain, the subject could be more effectively pursued, monitored and controlled to a degree which would be kind of unimaginable within previous disciplinary regimes. Within what Deleuze then goes on to call control society, writes Brian Masumi, when the walls come down, disciplinary command functions are not dismantled, but rather released. So if power now courses through the socius, rather than carving it up, its privileged site, according to much post-autonomous thought, so that would include perhaps the most familiar name is Antonio Negri, but also for figures such as Paolo Virno and Maurizio Lazzarato. They say that the privileged site of capital, the site from which it accumulates, is not the factory but the metropolis, and what they term the general intellect, which resides within its multitudes. So at this point, what these figures argue is that capital shifts to a mode of immaterial production, which is defined both as the labour, the new types of labour associated with the rise of information technology in the workplace, and of communication, creativity, and the production of affect as new forms of work. And it relocates its point of accumulation, as I've said, from the factory to the metropolis. Now, if we look at this in terms of contemporary architectural practice, we get a further, more complex turn, I would argue, in the relations between capital, labour, and the metropolis. Because what it does, as I've just been arguing, is it aims to interiorise the urban condition, and its corporate clients, so the corporate clients of architecture, are thus able to instrumentalise the smoothing of space between labour and communication, the factory and the metropolis, within a kind of coherent spatial formation. In this development, architecture realises for its corporate clients a space in which material production is articulated with its immaterial counterpart, so that the capacities of both are amplified through their mutual interaction, through, that is, the production and exchange of knowledge, which is made imminent to the production of commodities. Now, perhaps one of the best, perhaps the paradigmatic example of this, which I've been looking at a great deal of my own research, is this building, which is Zaha Hadid Architects' central building for BMW in Leipzig, which was completed in 2005. Now, this is conceived, it's, well, obviously we all know it's the building that that doesn't look like a conventional factory building. It's the one in the centre, and it's conceived, in the words of Hadid and the design, the BMW who kind of produced the brief for this, as being the communication hub of the industrial plant. And it's the building that links the three production areas and employs a number of means to generate a supposedly civic environment through which workers are supposedly formed into a community within its envelope around the common cause and identification with BMW. All employees, for example, assembly line and office workers, managers and other support staff have to access the site through this one entrance and encounter one another along its many passageways, intersections and communal spaces. Additionally, the assembly line on which the cars are conveyed between production areas passes through the central building and its office spaces, and its visual presence above serving symbolically to connect these workers to the material outcome of their labour, while suggesting aesthetically the dynamic of an urban transport infrastructure, and you can see here too to some extent that the type of porous and open spatial qualities of the urban are replicated here, or there's an attempt to replicate them through things like a minimal use of supporting columns and the cascading floor plates that establish spatial and visual continuities rather than divisions throughout the building. So another example, there's a cafeteria which is explicitly for the use of all of the factory staff, including all levels of workers and management. And this is called a market square. And the idea is that all employees will kind of congregate here, and they will be sharing knowledge and their experience of work, and this will go collectively towards improving the production overall. So whilst in some ways a project like this kind of suggests a return to those romantic but also corporate and paternalist models of community produced in the 19th century at places like Saltaire or Bourneville, BMW Leipzig fabricates an urban condition fine-tuned to the contemporary realities of production and its markets. Its replicant urbanism draws metropolitan forms of communication, knowledge, and affect, immaterial production that is, into immediate and instrumental proximity to commodity production. And in doing so, this project exemplifies the tendencies of those architects attempting to recruit the organisational potentials of the city within their own practice to effectively manage these in a fashion which, though serving new modes of production and valorisation for capital, is no less disciplinary in its enclosure and instrumental use of these potentials than the modernist project they suppose themselves to have advanced from. The putatively Deleuzian smoothing of architectural space does not stand opposed to its divisive striation as a social emancipatory development, but, as Masumi intimates, serves as the means through which control is released into an expanded terrain of operations. In reclaiming its province over urban form, then, to conclude, architecture does not recover its autonomy, but rather enters into a new set of relations with now hegemonic organisational models. The enveloping of the metropolitan condition, both in its forms and affects, serves as a vital point of accumulation for societies of control and the means through which its subjects are ever more effectively managed. That concludes my paper. Thank you. Yes, sorry.
So I think what we will outline essentially three hypotheses that starts actually with a question that Marina poses, that is to define a position on the city. And from our point of view, to define a position on the city as architects is ultimately to make a claim on architecture's relevance as well as architectural's instrumentality in the realm of the production of the city and from the city. So it is based, this position of ours is based on two larger ambitions. For us, one is that we see the city as still an overt site for new architectural knowledge, and that the conjectural impulse of architectural experimentation should be utilized to produce ideas for the city that in our sense we term as being relevant. So this two ambition in a way could be summarized as an ambition to re-empower the architect in the context of using architecture to think through the city and for it to affect the city. And in a way it's also an ambition that is triggered by three crises. The first one, of course, is the relentless speed and the colossal scale of urbanization of cities today have left almost both academia and practice to only deal with the city in an incremental manner and in a piecemeal manner. And the second crisis for us is that this speed and the scale of urbanization has also deviated from the Western mode of planning and mode of sustaining or perpetuating what is deemed as good urban design vis-a-vis the perpetuation of the traditional or historical European city. And lastly, the resultant of architecture of this urbanization, fueled by the market economy, further marginalized the disciplinary knowledge of architecture, and is only to serve the regime of difference in search of novelty. Thus, these three crises, we feel, is in a way disabling architects today from convincingly describe, conceptualize, and ultimately to theorize a coherent idea of the city vis-a-vis architecture. So what is there to be done? So tentatively for the past 6 years through Diploma Unit 6, we asked this question, and we've put forward 3 hypotheses that we want to present today. The first hypothesis is that for us, the city is embodied in its dominant type. From Cerdas housing block of Barcelona, the Georgian and Victorian terraces of London, to the skyscrapers of Manhattan, the city can be understood, described, conceptualized, and theorized to their own peculiar dominant type. Through Rossi, we learned that a singular building, as an element of permanence, is able to act as the repository of a city's history, construction and form within its type. For Rossi, type is independent of function and therefore pliable as the city's repository. Thus, to understand these types, according to Rossi, is to understand the city itself. This is unusual, actually, to put these 2 examples and these 2 seminal diagrams next to each other, but the second one is Ram Koolhaas from Delirious New York. So this possibility of conceptualizing and theorizing a city through a singular dominant type, that is an expression of particular cultural condition, also led Koolhaas to mythologize New York as this culture of congestion, all embodied within the downtown athletic club. Here, the skyscraper is recast as the apotheosis of metropolitan culture, a building type made up of a stack of autonomous, richly varied program, coexisting in a singular tower, made possible by the introduction of the elevator. Today, the reliance on a singular type to envision and brand new cities is evident in the iconic high-rises of Dubai and Shanghai. Here, the dominant type, that is the high-rise, is no longer utilized or valued as a formative element of the city, but is deployed to lubricate the marketing machinery of capitalism, where novelty and excess is the prerequisite of a city's global status. Thus, these values and historically free dominant types mirrors the culture of the global city, where the homogenizing culture of global capitalism finds its expression in the iconic high-rise, generic yet differentiated through value-free formal redundancy. Thus, the culture of the city and its raison d'etre finds its ultimate expression in the dominant types, which have contextually specific cultural, political, and economic characteristics. So now that I've briefly outlined what to us we see as dominant type through Rossi and also through Koolhaas, we put forth this second hypothesis. The second hypothesis has to do with type as an operative disciplinary knowledge of the city. So what we term by type being thought of as an operative disciplinary knowledge, we have to return to Duron as one of the first example in which an attempt to systematize architectural knowledge produces in the Précis and the Recueil of Duron, in which the introduction of a precedent as a prerequisite element in which architectural knowledge could be understood and to be reused to create new buildings or new solutions for different sites. Now, what is important to highlight here with Duron with regards to the disciplinary knowledge is that, and through type, is that type here is understood via two tropes. One is that type could be understood as in terms of its use, and also could be reduced in terms of its deep structure to certain geometric elements that could be recombined to create new solutions. Now, this has also entrenched a certain thinking of type as a method or typology of a method being bound by use, hereby looking at the barn as belonging to the same type because it shares the same image of the form as an image, but also in terms of its use, whether they use it school, barns, hospitals, and so on. But I think looking at type in that way is quite regressive, but instead it is more instrumental for us to begin to think of type as belonging to a series of object artifacts that is defined by a certain deep structure and that transcends or is not limited by its programmatic use. So for instance, in these two examples, Casa de Musica and Y2K House, one could argue, it's very evident that the building use is not the same, but one could argue that its deep structure or the structure that gives rise to its organization is the same. That is, to externalize what seems or what is conventionally internalized. That is the living room of the house, and also the performance chamber of a concert hall. So, and for us within DIPSIX is that it is true thinking type as a pliable diagram that we begin to imagine the reciprocal relationship between type or the building type in relation to the fabric of the city. Let's say in this case here, where it's the year in which we look at the brief of what we call London 2013, to rethink the London Olympic proposal in terms of its legacy plan. So what I very briefly want to highlight here is that what is seen as the deep structure that conventionally known in stadium structure, which is incredibly enclosed, by looking at its deep structure with regards to circulation and dispersal of movement, and to keep the same number of spectators, but as you go along the different diagrams, to reduce the segment, what we begin to see is the gradual transformation of what used to be a closed bowl structure to a stadium that is far more perforated and far more filigreed and inflected. And in that sense, this diagram enabled the projection of a certain idea in which different stadiums could be perhaps clustered together and to build a structure in which the fabric of a post-Olympic fabric could be imagined. So it's this reciprocal relationship between the building type and the city, between the type as a pliable and instrumental diagram, is important to us to rethink the disciplinary knowledge of architecture in regards to the city. So, and the final hypothesis that we want to put forth is that the city is still the overt site for architectural knowledge. And that is to say that through the city, ideas could be gained for the reinvention of architecture. So returning back to Rossi, besides the question of the empowerment of the architect, our interest in the city also lies in its potential to offer ideas for the reinvention of architecture. The ideas of the city, once conceptualized, can be abstracted and transposed as architectural ideas. This is evident in Rossi's seminal works, the Galeritas Housing and Modena Cemetery, where the idea of a city is understood through a singular architectural artifact. That is to say, the dominant type is and can still be a mnemonic structure for the city. Rossi's idea of the city rests in his assertion that the city can and should be understood through its architecture and as a gigantic cumulative construction over time, embodying its history and memory. He cites Palazzo di Ragione in Padua as an example of an architectural artifact, an architecture of permanence, able to absorb different uses through time. This suggests that its deep structure is independent of function and is an element of permanence in the city. This reading of the city enabled Rossi to use the fragments of the city or historical urban archetypes as set pieces for a present context, denying a linear and singular historical narrative and meaning, and yet maintaining an ambiguous continuity with the historical city. This is evident in his use of typical tenement housing and the exaggerated porticos in Galerata's housing. Here, the reduction and repetition of typical elements and the stripping away of commonly associated function to the building type in question enables an architecture that is able to contain new functions, embodies new meaning and association, and yet maintaining a continuity with history. Now, coming back to Rem again, similarly, the seminal section of the Downtown Athletic Club became the didactic diagram for Koolhaas' subsequent projects, where the traditional clarity of the figure ground building city idea is recast as an architectural idea based on the denial of the ground. In these projects, the neat division between functional zoning, site and building ground, solid and voids, are dismantled to conjure up the culture of congestion. So to surmise, the idea of the city and the idea of architecture are interchangeable and transposable if the city is understood and conceptualized through its dominant type. And it's this constant engagement with the city through the disciplinary knowledge of architecture via type that will enable architects to ultimately answer the question, why architecture?
Well, as Marina introduced, I'm going to deliver a critique of sustainable urbanism. It's not a sense because I have any real affection for sustainability or anything like on the other side. Is it? There we go. Okay. But it's more because it, to me, represents a kind of paradigm of which we see as typical of modern or liberal urbanism, which we kind of see as being reproduced since 19th century. And this is in two ways. One, in its form, i.e. its kind of reliance on infrastructure and deployment of similar systems, which I hope to kind of get into at a certain point here. But also in the way that it embraces a kind of rhetorics of reform and crisis, a kind of constant cycle of here we have a crisis, now how do we respond to it? And it's that which I see as problematic, and I have to explain here. In the recent years, architects have increasingly been given commissions to design new cities. This phenomenon has been accompanied by a certain commitment to terms of sustainability, which now seem inseparable from the urban project itself. While sustainability remains vague at best, it appears, no doubt, with an urgency similar to that which galvanized many of the great movements of modern architecture vis-a-vis the city. Often underlying such urgency is a rhetorical reference to a collective fear of one palpable sort or another. Fear of revolution in the case of Corbusier, fear of cultural tabula rasa, thinking of Jane Jacobs, Team 10, etc. And now our current fear, which is that of ecological collapse, which we respond to through this new notion of green architecture. In this way, how else can we explain a myriad eco-city projects popping up all around the world in a viable way, that if not for the fact that they appear against the background of imminent ecological catastrophe, a condition which is, of course, of terrifying proportions. Clearly, such a fear is wielded by the rhetoric of sustainability. However, upon closer inspection, the essence of this fear is hardly clear, and this is what I want to explore. Indeed, in light of ecological catastrophe, amidst any fetish for windmills and green vegetation, etc., that we find, architects have seemingly cultivated a curious nostalgia for the present. A pragmatism whose lack of patience for the past seeks a kind of reconstitution of the present in imagining any future. So before proposing a kind of concrete position on the contemporary city, it seems worthwhile to examine this impulse. by uncovering the fear, like the true fear, which may lie at the core of today's urban project, namely the eco-city. And I want to interrogate the rhetoric and forms of representation used to animate that project. To do so, it is useful to first characterize the operative status of the urban project today, emphasizing that its remit is strictly intermediary. It has become an increasingly accessible venture for private unregulated investment. Then the central task of urban design today is instead to construct sophisticated, high-profile branded advertisement campaigns used to leverage popular or democratic support for basically large-scale real estate development. Its inspiration remains market speculation, and its objective is the facilitation of growth. Because such projects in themselves bear no actual pretensions of being executed or doing what they propose. And it's often very unclear, in fact, what they propose if you actually look through the documents that they present. Its service is instead to lend the architect's endorsement to an anonymous body who will carry out the project in its name, i.e. the developer. The images produced have no need for cohesion with that which may or may not be built. Instead, the success of urban design depends only on the composition of images and the text of their and a corroboration with the language of sustainability. So to talk about the rhetoric of sustainability, it wholly embraces a kind of humanitarian ethics vis-a-vis ecological catastrophe. Also, it avoids at all costs the pomposity of a clear political position. And in that case, such ethics are often conveyed by a means of impressive data, statistics, and impending notions of tipping points quickly approaching. In this way, the discourse of sustainability has given a new life to that old humanist impulse, raising the stakes in this case with its implicit humanitarian call to duty. Not surprisingly, because such ideals feed off an economy of good intentions, they simultaneously remain beyond the scrutiny, since the survival of our species seems to depend on their promise. It also implicit in such ethical posturing is a kind of imposed state of exception, paralyzing the process of architectural criticism. Introducing this silent suspension of judgment, the language of sustainability plays a crucial role in the propagation of such work. For the purpose of urban design remains ultimately to equip the absolutely ordinary with the rhetorical supplement of ethical goodness. Thus, by posturing in this way, the rhetoric of sustainability at once deflects criticism while guaranteeing popular support for its virtuous cause. Perhaps more importantly, the dominant visual language of ecological urban design, and I'm sorry to say I don't have any kind of crucial examples, but I'm sure if you've paid attention to architecture in the past 5 or so years, you know what I'm talking about. Urban design has introduced a bizarre twist to the traditional relationship between figure and ground through its dazzlingly rendered imagery. The fundamental shift to be observed is in the treatment of the figure of the composition. In contrast to renderings used to portray a single building that we may be more familiar with from the past, where a precisely composed fore and background frame the figure, when a project becomes urban in scale, the figure of the image seemingly disappears, leaving only a constructed ground. This absence of figure, rendered in hyperrealist brilliance, confirms both a growing appeal to sensation and effect, while at the same time suggests a retreat of the project in and for itself. The distance between fore and background, no longer held in tension by an identifiable figure, collapses into a confused state of total atmosphere, leaving a viewer incapable of perceiving the project in terms outside of pure appearance. I brought along a magazine which has very small images, which I can pass around later. I apologize for my poor presentation. Because of this, the content of this imagery is itself far more interesting, for in such saturated ambience, there lies an implicit injunction to view the image with a kind of melancholia, as if it is a snapshot of a life that seemingly once was. An image indicating neither past nor future asks not what could be, but what should be. Compounded with the rhetoric of ecological disaster embedded in the eco-city, we can view this imagery as a kind of visual catalog of all that which is threatened and which must be preserved. Yet far from a concern for the annihilation of nature, for nature in such images appears not as an endangered wilderness, but as an abundant and manipulable surface. I think that's an important point. An overused accessory of the urban. Such imagery makes visible another far deeper fear. Indeed, what is conveyed is the fear of loss not of a threatened nature and its capacity to sustain life, but the loss of the conditions which sustain a threatened liberal utopia. By simply stripping the technological and vegetal accessories of such imagery, this fear of loss becomes clearer. The compositions propose little more than a liberal nostalgia for the present, a kind of ethereal, simulated present, if you will. Ethics in this rhetorical structure ultimately serve to discipline the architectural imagination, reducing it to a pathological reinterpretation of the present. The eco-city stands as a token of our present notion of urban cosmopolitanism, complete with its technological supplement, the paranoid apparatus necessary to sustain its liberal core amidst ecological havoc. From this perspective, the role of the eco-city becomes clear. The eco-city is merely a phantasmic screen, prohibiting us from confronting the true terrors of ecological catastrophe, while at once imploring us to silently identify this terror with instead the collapse of liberal capitalism itself. If these claims are indeed true, the fantasy that the ecological future is also and only a liberal future must be dispelled, if only for the fact that constructing such fantasies as eco-cities is itself perverse. For what they promise is paradoxically to transform a crumbling political system into a terrifying condition of utter exclusion and deprivation, as their only true assurance is the privatization of the entire urban realm itself. The architectural imagination of the city must instead be rendered in all its political clarity, and I want to conclude to say to advance a true program of sustainability, one must vigorously imagine the city beyond liberalism. Thanks.